Well, it's time now for perspective. Last week, a young white man in Atlanta, Georgia, went on a killing spree across 3 locations. 6 of the 8 people he killed were women of Asian descent. And those murders didn't come in a vacuum, with hate crimes against Asian Americans spiking in recent months, fueled by rhetoric that blames China for the global COVID-19 pandemic. But a growing number of Asian American lawmakers, activists and writers are determined to challenge the widespread discrimination. Among them, my guest today, the Vietnamese American Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Viet Thanh Nguyen. He's also a professor of English and American Studies and Ethnicity. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us here on France 24 today. I'd like to know, what was your first reaction when you heard about what happened last week in Atlanta?
Well, thanks for having me. Obviously, just shock and horror that this had happened. We have a uniquely American problem, mass shootings. And these mass shootings affect all Americans, but they have targeted Asian Americans before. But I think this was a particularly painful reminder, especially after a year in which the rhetoric against COVID-19 as being somehow a Chinese disease, using the rhetoric of the Kung flu and the China virus by the Trump administration, had started to really ratchet up pressure on Asian Americans. We've seen a year of increasing anti-Asian hate crimes, violence, and rhetoric throughout the United States and indeed around the world, from what I've seen. And I think many of us felt that things were getting worse, that there have been more and more physical and verbal assaults. And so as shocking and horrifying as this mass shooting was, it was also kind of not a surprise given the rhetoric around anti-Asian feeling here.
Now, in the wake of last week's shooting, a number of Asian Americans have been talking about the possibly traditional Asian migrant mentality, that desire to keep your head down, to not ruffle too many feathers, and how that maybe hasn't protected the community against xenophobia. Do you agree that Asians in America historically have tried not to put their head above the parapet?
I think it's mixed. I think there certainly has been that sentiment of Asian Americans, especially immigrants of the first generation, wanting to simply do their work and get along and not cause trouble. But historically, throughout the entire history of Asian Americans in this country, Asian Americans have mobilized themselves politically ever since the first Chinese immigrants in the 19th century went to court to try to protect their rights. And there have been mass labor movements. There have been radical activists in the Asian American community. Some of the most famous ones have been Yuri Kochiyama, who was there with Malcolm X when he was assassinated, Grace Lee Boggs, who's considered one of the major revolutionary theorists in the late 20th century, and many others. So there's been a very vibrant Asian American movement for several decades trying to protect the rights and advance the interests of Asian Americans.
Now, anti-Asian discrimination in the US is nothing new. Over 100,000 Japanese Americans or people of Japanese descent were forcibly relocated to internment camps in the US during the Second World War, simply because they were from Japan or from Japanese families. Do you think the US has ever been forced to reckon with that difficult history?
Well, I think there have been moments where the U.S. has been forced to reckon with it. For example, you mentioned the internment. I think that's absolutely right. That was a mass act of violence against Japanese Americans, many of whom were citizens. And speaking of Japanese Americans not simply being quiet, there was a large movement to claim redress and reparations for Japanese Americans in the 1980s, where Japanese Americans finally spoke up and talked about their history. And the United States Congress did, in fact, apologize to Japanese Americans and gave them symbolic financial reparations. So that was a moment of reckoning in Asian American history, where Americans as a whole acknowledged that this was wrong. This was unconstitutional, what happened to Japanese Americans. So we've had moments of reckoning, but not enough. And that's why I think this event has come as a shock, not only to Asian Americans, but to many other Americans who have not thought about this issue.
And do you think what we saw in Atlanta last week could spark another moment of reckoning in the US?
Well, I think it's happening. I think more people are talking about it. And, Asian Americans are certainly, again, we've spoken up before, but I think we're speaking with particular force at this moment. And the community is larger than it's been in the past. Asian Americans now constitute about 5.6% of the American population. There's more and more visibility. And going to the issue of not being quiet and not simply trying to get along, more and more Asian Americans are not just doctors or lawyers or engineers, but we're also storytellers and politicians and activists. And more of us are being quite vocal about demanding recognition and change.
Now, many activists, yourself included, attribute these attacks to systemic racism, the way these sorts of incidents are also policed. Systemic racism, we also know, is a huge issue for the African American community in the US. How much do you think that these two groups, Asian Americans and African Americans, have in common as far as discrimination is concerned?
One thing we have a lot in common. We both have a complicated history in the United States. African people were enslaved and brought here to this country to serve as forced labor, and the country wouldn't be what it is today without that massive exploitation. And Asian immigrants were brought to this country for labor purposes as well. That's why the first Chinese immigrants came in the 19th century to work on the railroad and on mining and on many other things. And we see a complicated history because even those first Chinese immigrants, their usefulness on the railroad was done. Some of them were brought to Mississippi to work to try to compete against formerly enslaved Black people in the South. So we've had both of these histories of aligned interests, being exploited labor, and being pitted against each other at the same time. So you'll see these kinds of tensions between these populations. But there's also been a long history of African Americans and Asian Americans linking themselves in solidarity and articulating their shared interests against a system of white supremacy that would seek to divide and exploit them.
Now, your latest novel, The Committed, came out earlier this month. It's been described as a powerful challenge to an enduring narrative of colonialism and neo-colonialism. How important a role do you think literature can play in today's world in minorities' fight to be heard?
Well, I think it's crucial. I think what's crucial is obviously political and social movements, but what literature brings and why literature is crucial to these political and social movements is that through literature, we can tell our own stories, we can re-narrate the past, and we can contest the dominant narrative of the country that we find ourselves in. So obviously for the United States, I think there is a strong narrative of pluralism and representation and multiculturalism and sort of an optimistic orientation towards the future. But none of that can actually happen unless we can recognize how this country has been built on colonization that's still going on if you ask indigenous peoples, and a recognition that this country is built on this contradiction between the aspirations towards liberty and democracy and its roots in slavery, genocide, and war. This is how we as a country, on the one hand, can have a President Obama, and then on the other hand, immediately follow him with a President Trump. That's not an aberration. That's an expression of the fundamental contradiction of this country. And that's what literature can draw attention to. A novel like The Committed looks squarely at these contradictions of both American and French societies.
And do you think that minorities in the UK now have a champion in President Biden?
Minorities in the UK.
Sorry, in the USA. Sorry, I misspoke there.
In the United States. Okay, sure. I think he is certainly much more of a champion than President Trump, which is not saying a whole lot. But I think certainly with his selection of Kamala Harris as his vice president and with other gestures that he's making, he's certainly much more inclusive in his orientation, recognizing that the country is already inherently multicultural and that we need to have representatives from all these populations and that we need to do things, for example, like right now, having a voting system that is open to everyone, including people of color in this country, rather than trying to shut down our voting system to make it more difficult, especially for minorities.
Viet Thanh Nguyen, acclaimed writer and professor, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us here on France 24 Today.